You know what makes Janice Soprano dangerous? It is not the body count. It is not her spiritual journey. It is not even the endless reinventions that somehow always end with her standing in someone else's living room, claiming someone else's resources, like destiny just misfiled the paperwork. It is that she feels normal. Not normal as in healthy, normal as in familiar. The kind of familiar that makes the room go quiet because everyone has met this person. The relative who shows up calling it a fresh start, and within 20 minutes the conversation has become a guilt trial, the furniture has been rearranged, and somehow the grief belongs to them now, and that is the real trick. Janice does not need to win with force. She wins with framing, with moral language, with just enough truth to make the lies stick. She can accuse Tony of sabotaging her happiness and be correct, while still using happiness as a crowbar to pry open the family vault. She can play wounded daughter, devoted partner, transformed adult, and still leave the same trail: resentment, leverage, and people quietly wondering when their lives stopped being theirs. So here's the warning. If Janice makes the most sense in the room is already in trouble. And by the time the smile arrives, sweet, confident, entitled, the damage has already been rebranded as family. Janice Soprano is the rare character who can make an entire room feel grimy without raising her voice. And that is not an insult to the writing or the performance. It is the point, executed with almost irritating precision. She arrives with the practiced air of someone who has mistaken survival instincts for a personality, and calls it a spiritual journey, a reinvention, a fresh start, anything except what it actually is. Opportunism with a self-help soundtrack. The most inconvenient truth about Janice, however, is that she is occasionally correct, which only makes her worse. When she throws Tony the line about how he cannot stand to see her happy, it lands because it is recognizably accurate. Tony does not merely dislike her. He resents the idea that she could stroll into the wreckage of the family narrative, smile, and claim the benefits without paying the full price of the misery that raised them. Tony admits as much in therapy when he complains that she spent years running off and enjoying herself while he stayed behind to manage Livia's gravity well. That grievance, petty and sincere at the same time, exposes the show's most believable poison. Family dynamics do not dissolve because someone can name them in a therapist's office. The core pattern remains: jealousy dressed up as righteousness, contempt disguised as concern, and a relentless need to pull anyone's head back under the water the moment they appear to be breathing. In that sense, Janice's accusation is not merely about Tony being mean. It is about how the entire ecosystem functions. Someone else's happiness reads as an accusation, and an accusation must be answered. One version of the argument insists Tony and Carmela are always genuinely upset when someone else is happy or doing well, as though joy itself is an act of provocation. Another version pushes back, noting that Carmela is not universally threatened by happiness. She can be genuinely pleased for a friend's romance, for instance, until the happiness touches a nerve she has been instructed to keep raw. Status, money, independence, the suffocating identity of being only a wife. When Carmela bristles at another woman's competence or financial agency, it is less a hatred of joy than a flash of shame at her own constraints, followed immediately by the need to convert that shame into judgment. That is how this household runs. Emotions are not processed, they are reallocated. And because guilt is the family's preferred currency, the manipulation has a moral glow to it, particularly in the way domestic virtue can be deployed as a weapon. The stereotype of Catholic guilt gets invoked for a reason. It offers a language of suffering that doubles as leverage, a way to look depressed at someone else's contentment and call it principle. Whether Carmela is always dimmed by her family's joy, or only dimmed by the kinds of joy that implicate Tony's worst appetites, infidelity, cruelty, swaggering misbehavior, the underlying mechanism remains familiar. Nothing is simply allowed to be uncomplicated. Janice understands this machinery because she is made from the same parts, and she uses it with the blunt enthusiasm of someone who never learned the difference between intimacy and control. That is why the family realism cuts. The show does not pretend that insight cures anything. Epiphanies are decorative. The cycle is structural. Janice, unfortunately, treats structure like a ladder. The case against her is not subtle. It is cumulative, season by season, scheme by scheme, with a consistency that becomes almost comedic if it were not so corrosive. The first indictment is motive. She returns to New Jersey not as a prodigal seeking reconciliation, but as a claimant seeking assets: Livia's house, Livia's attention, Livia's authority, and, by extension, the family's hierarchy. The fantasy is control. Take the home, take the narrative, take the position of injured daughter who came back to do the right thing. The reality is that she fails at dominating Livia because Livia cannot be dominated. She can only be survived, and even that is uncertain. Then comes Richie April, and the romance has all the tenderness of a hostile takeover. The relationship reads as strategy, a way to outrun her brother's power by attaching herself to a man who might challenge it. When that challenge does not accelerate fast enough, she escalates, goading, provoking, inflaming, pushing Richie toward the unthinkable, not because she is committed to some ideological rebellion, but because she is impatient with the timeline. The show does not ask anyone to admire the audacity. It asks them to notice how casually she treats fratricide as a project management tool. If there is a single moment when her selfishness accidentally benefits others, it is the one in which Richie's abuse collides with her refusal to be struck, and she kills him. Solving problems is a dangerous phrase in this world, but it applies here. His death removes a threat, closes a storyline, and spares Tony a collision that would have been bloodier. The fact that Janice can stumble into doing the useful thing without doing the good thing is precisely what makes her so unsettling. Next comes her obsession with the house again, and the feeling that Tony all but gifts it to her, which she accepts with the serene entitlement of someone who believes the universe owes her restitution for a childhood she has not finished litigating. Then there is Svetlana's leg, an act so petty, so grotesquely symbolic, it feels like the writers dared themselves to define low and then went lower. It is theft not for survival, but for dominance, a tantrum dressed as conquest, followed by a conveniently timed pivot toward religion, as though spiritual branding can launder character. The pattern repeats with Ralph Cifaretto: proximity to power, appetite for attention, and a willingness to play whatever part will keep her centered. She drifts away when the calculus changes, then aims for Bobby Baccalieri, the grieving widower, the gentle soldier, the man whose defining trait is devotion. Janice's interest in Bobby reads less like romance than acquisition. She wants the kind of loyalty he had for Karen, and she wants it because it is the one commodity she cannot counterfeit without a living supply. Watching her maneuver into that household, so soon after Karen's death, so brazenly through the children, feels like watching someone rearrange furniture in a room that still smells like a funeral. The Ouija board incident and the instant message manipulation of Bobby's kids do not merely make her unpleasant. They establish a willingness to weaponize children's grief for her own placement. It is cruelty with a smile, which is always the worst kind, because it forces everyone else to decide whether to protest and look dramatic or stay quiet and be complicit. And then, just to keep the audience from relaxing into a single note of hatred, the show offers a sliver of growth. Anger management, a momentary attempt at restraint, the faint suggestion that being married to Bobby might have softened her into something less predatory. The irony is that this progress, small, fragile, and arguably performative, still counts as progress in a world where nobody improves without hurting someone first. The dinner table episode in which Tony deliberately needles her into rage is therefore especially revealing. It is not merely low, it is diagnostic. When she is actually trying, an unfamiliar concept for someone who usually treats effort as something other people should do, Tony sabotages her, not because he needs to, but because he cannot tolerate her escaping the family's shared sentence. He drags her son into the conversation like a hook into soft tissue, and when she snaps, the table gets to call it classic Janice, as though the provocation never happened. That moment is the family compact in miniature. Self-betterment is permitted only if it does not threaten the hierarchy, and certainly not if it implies someone else could have changed sooner. From there, Janice becomes the quiet force behind Bobby's transformation, nudging, pressuring, encouraging him into greater responsibility with Tony, which in this context means deeper moral ruin with better perks. If she can get Bobby promoted, she can get herself promoted. And the show is not coy about how that ambition feeds on his decency. Her eventual move into Johnny Sack's house continues the theme. She treats real estate like destiny, as though occupying a large home can retroactively prove she deserved it all along. And then the finale's aftertaste arrives. Bobby's death, the children, and Janice's priorities. The coldest interpretation argues she does not truly care about Bobby Jr., and keeps Sophia mainly to preserve the attachment between Sophia and her own daughter, Dominica, because the relationships she values are the ones that serve her emotionally and socially, not the ones that demand sacrifice. In the same breath, she circles Junior's estate with the familiar hunger for inheritance, returning to the oldest play in her book: take the assets, declare it justice, call anyone who objects toxic, and move on. It is difficult to find a more succinct emblem of her character than the grin over a disability check from Washington State. Not because receiving assistance is shameful, but because her expression suggests triumph rather than need, a delighted sense that she has outsmarted a system she believes exists to be gained. That grin is the same grin she wears when she senses leverage, the face of someone who mistakes exploitation for intelligence. The question of whether she has any redeeming qualities becomes less a moral inquiry than a stress test for the audience's patience. Some insist there is not one, and the argument is not frivolous. Compared with other characters, who sometimes show compassion that exceeds their appetites, Janice can feel uniquely hollow, as though every emotion is an audition. She abandons a son, leaves him vulnerable, and later performs motherhood as a stage role when it becomes socially useful. She manipulates lovers with a focus that would be admirable if it were not directed at destruction. She thrives on conflict so reliably that nearly every scene featuring her carries the expectation of an argument that did not need to happen. Yet even a character as designed to be loathsome as Janice accumulates moments that complicate the purity of hatred. There is the rare instance of solid parenting, calling out Bobby Jr.'s defiance with a blunt demand for accountability, a moment so unexpectedly competent it almost shocks Tony into something like respect. There is the moment she tells Richie that it does not matter if his son is gay, an instance of clarity in a household marinated in prejudice. There is her ability to control her temper, briefly, after anger management work, and the advice she gives Tony about not letting anger dominate every reaction. Advice that is sensible precisely because it is delivered by someone who needs it most. There is the note of genuine emotion after Bobby's death, and oh my god, that reads less like performance and more like a crack in the mask. There are comedic talents, an extraordinary visual sense that becomes a running joke, an unexpectedly decent shot with a gun, and the occasional line delivery that turns domestic chaos into dark farce. There is the small courtesy of posting a meaningful saying in Tony's hospital room, an act that might be kindness or might be branding, but still lands as something other than extraction. There is even the absurd footnote that she once won second prize in a beauty contest, the kind of trivia that sounds like a family myth, until it becomes one more reminder that people do not start as monsters. They become them through practice. And yes, there is the recurring observation that she is sexually adventurous, willing to match partners' appetites, including the more taboo demands of someone like Ralph. It is not framed as virtue so much as utility, another angle she can work, but it also explains part of her appeal to men who should have known better. Which brings the discussion to the why. What was the appeal of Janice to Richie, Ralph, Bobby, and even the younger boyfriend seen in her past? The explanations converge on a familiar blend: history and provocation with Richie, who carries his own confusion and enjoys the added benefit of irritating Tony; taboo and transactional thrill with Ralph, whose private desires align with her willingness to indulge them, and whose public calculations include access to Tony's orbit; and vulnerability with Bobby, whose grief creates an opening for someone skilled at inserting herself as comfort while quietly rewriting the household. Janice is adept at getting what she wants, even when her manipulation is transparent, because she targets people at their weakest: the bereaved, the ambitious, the lonely, the resentful. She makes herself feel inevitable. The show's darker implication is that ordinary life offers fewer guardrails than the mafia does. In the mob world, a sociopath with Tony's traits can convert ruthlessness into power. In civilian life, the same traits look like the kind of petty, grasping chaos everyone recognizes from a relative who ruins holidays. That is why some describe Janice as a female Tony, and why others reject it. Tony is monstrous, but he works hard, he carries a warped sense of duty, and he is backed by institutional violence. Janice is monstrous in a smaller key, less capable, more parasitic, a thief of emotional and financial oxygen rather than an architect of organized force. If there is a closer mirror, it is Livia. The same narcissistic hunger, the same ability to turn suffering into weaponry, the same talent for making everyone else feel guilty for not catering to her needs. Calling Janice Livia in training may even be too generous. She does not merely replicate the pattern, she modernizes it. Therapy language, activism nostalgia, spiritual tourism, welfare gaming, maternal performance, and real estate aspiration, all fused into a single ongoing campaign for attention and entitlement. That nostalgia about marching for civil rights, that self-presentation as different from a bigoted upbringing, is not meaningless. It suggests she once tried on a genuine moral identity. But the bitter punchline is the gap between the stated values and the lived conduct. The rhetoric is lofty. The behavior is petty, controlling, and frequently cruel. The show uses her to demonstrate that adopting the language of progress does not equal becoming a better person. It can just as easily become a new dialect of self-justification. And because this is The Sopranos, the debate expands outward. If Janice is the worst, what does that even mean in a series packed with killers, extortionists, and casual sadists? Some argue that other characters, like Polly, get a pass because they are funny, even though their immorality is thorough and unrepentant. Others point to Christopher as a stronger candidate for most psychopathic, highlighting his envy, sabotage, violence, and self-pity, including the way he drags others down when they seem to be doing well. This argument is not an attempt to rehabilitate Janice. It is an admission that likability and morality are not the same metric, and the show deliberately scrambles them. Janice is not always the most violent, but she may be the most domestically recognizable. The kind of manipulator who does not need a gun to terrorize a room. The kind of person who can make a plate of baked ziti feel like a threat. Even her supposedly benign actions carry the shadow of calculation, bringing food, playing peacemaker, offering advice, because the audience has learned that nothing is offered without a price. The comedy of lines like Acts of Janice or the rebranding to Parvati is that the character keeps trying to rename herself into innocence while dragging the same damage everywhere she goes. The show also sprinkles in uglier implications around this family's past. Side comments about predation and theft, the sort of casually dropped anecdote that signals how early and how deeply boundaries were violated in this world. Those details do not excuse Janice. They contextualize the soil she grew in. And then there is Carmela again, floating in and out of this critique as the series' other master of domestic leverage. The only person besides Janice who can go toe-to-toe with Tony in a scene without getting flattened. Carmela's jealousy can be sharp, her moral logic opportunistic, her depression selectively activated when it serves as pressure. But even there, the show allows nuance. She can be happy for someone else until that happiness threatens her own curated sense of status or her fear that she never built a self beyond marriage. In contrast, Janice often looks like a character engineered to be irredeemable, and that engineering is precisely why she works. Aida Turturro's performance is so effective that it creates a useful confusion. Hatred of the person becomes proof of the craft. The character is an excellent heel, a chaos agent, a plot accelerant, and a psychological X-ray of Tony's origin story. Scenes featuring her are rarely tranquil, which becomes its own kind of structural clarity. When Janice enters, the show is about to expose something ugly that everyone else prefers to keep implicit. Over time, some viewers shift from hating her presence to appreciating what her presence does, how it forces confrontations, how it sharpens Tony's self-disgust, how it shows that family is not a sanctuary, but an ongoing negotiation over pain. The bond between Tony and Janice, as vicious as it is, also demonstrates that they share a private language of toxicity that feels normal to them because it is the air they breathed as children. They can laugh together after a fight because for them, the emotional bruising is not an exception, it is tradition. Tony will clean up a murder for her, partly because it benefits him, but also because the bond is real in the bleakest way. She is one of the few people who truly knows him, and she is unafraid to challenge him because she knows exactly where his shame lives. In the end, the Janice debate collapses into the show's most perverse accomplishment. A character can be atrocious as a human being and invaluable as storytelling. Janice may be weak compared with Tony in the criminal hierarchy, but she is formidable in the domestic one, where power is measured in guilt, access, and narrative control. She is simultaneously absurd and frightening, the woman who cannot play guitar well, whose cooking is treated with suspicion, who bungles reinventions, and yet who repeatedly manages to insert herself into other people's lives and rearrange them for her benefit. That is the real critique, and it is why the disdain sticks. Janice does not merely do bad things. She does them with the smug confidence of someone who believes she is owed compensation for being alive. When she tries, she is sabotaged. When she does not try, she is rewarded often enough to keep going. When she is cruel, she dresses it as honesty. When she is selfish, she dresses it as self-care. When she is caught, she pivots to a new identity. The show does not ask anyone to forgive her, but it does invite a grim recognition. In a family where love is tangled with resentment and suffering is a competitive sport, Janice is not an anomaly. She is a symptom who learned to speak. And when the final verdict arrives, whether she is the worst, merely the most irritating, or simply the most expertly designed villain, the only response that feels entirely consistent with the series' worldview is the one it keeps returning to, like a shrug that doubles as a curse. Anyway, $4 a pound. Subscribe if you want more analysis of the monsters who don't need guns, just guilt, need, and a kitchen table.